Ari Redboard.
And I'm Isabella Chase.
Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software.
At the end of June, FATF released its fourth targeted update on the implementation of FATF standards on virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. The report surveys 151 jurisdictions to find out what they've done to comply with the FATF recommendations. And with the results now in, we can see that many are not doing enough, with 75% of jurisdictions that have made changes to their regimes only having done so in a partially or non-compliant way. And only half of countries have brought in changes to accommodate the travel rule.
We are psyched to welcome the perfect panel to discuss all of these issues and what it means for the virtual asset industry. We have Lana Schwartzman, Head of Regulatory and Compliance, and Catarina Veloso, Senior Associate for Regulatory Compliance at Notabene. Lana, Catarina, we have been wanting to do this forever. Thank you so much for joining TRM Talks. What I love about a TRM Talks like this is it is really so practical. And I think there's a lot for, VASPs in the space and even regulators to kind of take from this conversation. As we take off here, Lana, what were the sort of main points that really stood out to you from FATF's sort of most recent statement?
This was a great targeted update, and I highly recommend it to be read if anybody hasn't read it yet. They made a lot of great points, and I'll share with you the ones that I guess stood out the most to me. First of all, FATF reported that jurisdictions have made insufficient progress in implementing travel rule and urged countries to introduce the required legislation and regulations to operationalize travel rule compliance through supervision and enforcement. Kind of key, let me underline that kind of, as I say that, right? Supervision and enforcement. They also brought up the sunrise period as a persistent issue. And for those that may not know, the sunrise period refers to when the travel rule is not in full effect across jurisdictions. FATF stated that until all VASPs are required to implement the travel rule, VASPs operating in or from jurisdictions with the travel rule obligations will continue to face challenges executing all covered transactions in a compliant manner. Another great point was that in most countries, domestic VASPs must transact with regulated and or travel rule compliant counterparties or must otherwise mitigate risks. FATF provided interesting insights into how jurisdictions are currently handling the sunrise issues and more generally, the ability to transact with counterparties. They stated that 26% of jurisdictions still allow VASPs to transact regardless of the licensing status, travel rule compliance, or risk mitigating measures. And that blew my mind. Then the clarification point that counterparty VASP due diligence must be carried out independently was really welcomed as a clarification point. FATF clarified that VASPs are required to independently assess counterparty risk, and that current approach taken primarily by close travel networks does not remove the need for VASPs to independently verify the information and ensure that all relevant domestic obligations are met. Further, FATF clarified and reiterated that travel rule is a pre-transaction requirement, and that is important because some of the close protocols are operating post-transaction. It was also refreshing to have FATF give clear examples of shortcomings in available travel rule compliance tools.
Really, really awesome summary. And thank you so much, Lana. Isabella, as you know, you're my FATF expert on all things. And obviously, you've had a lot of engagement with FATF over the course of the last few years. It feels to me like we've been building towards this statement from FATF for some time, right? Implementation. Those are have been the priorities. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what stands out for you here about this most recent statement and have we been building towards it?
Yeah, and that's a really good way of looking at it, because I think the last point really that the report makes is around this kind of want to say deadline that's going to come in the first half of next year, when FATF is going to produce this list of countries that are either FATF members or have materially important or significant virtual asset sectors. And they're going to list exactly what countries have been doing to either implement the travel rule or get full recommendation 15 compliant. So to your point, like, what have we been building to? We are building, I think, very much now to this point where we're going to be producing this table to really understand in a clear way what countries have been doing. So yeah, I think that's a really valid point that you make. Obviously, Lana has covered all the big travel rule highlights. We'll leave that to the experts. But a couple of other points that stood out to me as well from this report, because it's more than just the travel rule. The points around emerging risk areas like DeFi, peer-to-peer, and TF, and to some extent, proliferation financing as well. On those first few categories, very much still taking a watch and monitor approach, much more concern around the North Korea threat. But I think for me, the point that stood out the most and I thought was so fascinating was around risk assessments, and how time and time again, they are seeing countries really struggling to know where to start with risk assessments. We know methodologies are problematic. That is true across the AML CFT space. But what's really countries are struggling with is data availability to understand what's going on with virtual assets. And to me, that is so interesting. But because of course, this is a sector that we have the most data on. We've never had a regulated sector where we have so much transparent data. So the fact that countries are struggling with this area, I think is really interesting and is something that we all need to really overcome together, getting the right data in the hands of the right people so that we can take a really effective risk-based approach to all of this.
Really helpful. Thank you.
Moving much more into the meat of the travel rule sections of the report. Catarina, we've already mentioned a bunch of the numbers on travel rule implementation that it features. And we've talked about some of the challenges as well. Lana spoke about the sunrise issue. I think also the issues around sort of domestic VASPs and pre-transaction times also really important. If we know what all these challenges are, why do you think that implementation has been lacking so much up until this point?
Thank you, Isabel. I think that's a great question. To be honest, I think adoption has been slow and difficult and painful because travel rule struggles with the first mover problem. And what I mean by that is that the task of complying with the travel rule is a lot more complex for the VASPs based in the jurisdictions that require it first. And this is because, as you know, travel rule is about exchanging information with your counterparty VASPs about the parties to the transaction to be able to increase transparency and enable better business decisions. So naturally, you're only able to fully comply with the travel rule with the collaboration of the counterparty VASP. And if your counterparty is in a jurisdiction that has not yet implemented the travel rule, or that perhaps doesn't even have a licensing framework for VASP, which is also a shortcoming that is highlighted in the report, then it's very unlikely that your counterparty will be willing or ready to collaborate with you and engage in travel rule flows. So essentially, the first VASPs trying to comply have a difficult task in their hands. And because of that, essentially, no one wants to make moves if the rest of the world is not making moves as well, which kind of gets us stuck in a vicious cycle. So no one wants to move first because moving first is more complicated. And as you said, the report highlights that jurisdictions made insufficient progress. I think they mentioned that only 35 jurisdictions passed legislation and only 13 are actually supervising and enforcing. And today, this really creates an issue that I think is at the heart of most operational challenges that VASP face today. We always come back to the sunrise issue whenever we're dealing with the operational challenges that exist today. So I think when the FATF in the report urges countries to implement the travel rule, I think in this report and on this specific matter, they are not only worried that the countries are falling short of the guidelines that they set, they are also worried about the fact that the slow progress in some jurisdictions is getting in the way of the efforts that VASPs elsewhere are doing to comply, because you can really only achieve full compliance and get rid of the operational challenges once everyone works on it.
Yeah, it's a really key point, and it just goes to the mentality that's been out there for years. I think across the globe. Really well said. Isabella, I've got one for you, and Lana, I'd love you to build off of this. But what are the challenges for implementation? And I think Catarina started to get into this a little bit, that you think were sort of missed or not in FATF's latest report or statement.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just keep it really, really short on this one. I think, and it is acknowledged to some extent, but I think the huge technical uplift that bringing the travel rule into a country's laws and also supervision and enforcement is kind of not given quite enough attention. I recognize from FATF's perspective, they're quite frustrated at this point, 4 years on, but I think we could, maybe be talking a little bit more about actually this is a really big challenge for countries to bring this in an effective way. And as Catarina says, without sort of good examples or peers to learn from, that creates further challenges as well. So I think, there could have been a little bit more focus on actually to operationalize this. It's really, really difficult. And there could have been a bit more of that in the report. Lana, what do you think?
I think you've hit it spot on. Maybe the only thing that I would add to this, and I'll just add a little, I don't know if Catarina, you want to also kind of tag team this one together. But many of the challenges associated with rolling out travel rule compliance are operational, as we said, and these are usually and naturally outside of the scope of topic that FATF covers in its report and guidance, and it's also very often outside the scope of the national travel rule laws and regulations. Do you want to, Catarina, maybe you want to tag team this one around maybe some of the operational challenges?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I think as you were saying, the main challenges associated with, or many of the challenges associated with the travel rule are operational. And I do understand that these are not covered in the FATF or national laws, as Lana was just saying. So I think I would say the first operational challenge for VASPs is to actually become aware of all the operational challenges that come with the travel rule. Even that is a challenge, to understand what challenges you need to tackle. And we say this because when you first read travel rule requirements, it's very easy to overlook the operational complexities that come with it. For example, how do you discover whether you're transacting with an unhosted wallet or with a VASP, and which specific VASP it is? And that's, for instance, a part where TRM can really help, and that we leverage TRM for in our integration. And then questions like, what do you do if you receive a deposit with no travel rule information? How do you return the funds to the originator? Because the originator might not be able to receive the funds in the originating address, right? So how do you know where to send these funds? And the list goes on. We could talk about it the whole day. And to be honest, I do not expect the FATF or local legislators to cover these challenges in regulations or guidance. I think in many cases, the solutions to these challenges need to come from the industry. We need to lead the effort on that. So for instance, I think the industry should lead the creation of a global decentralized standard for identifying VASPs, which we're lacking at the moment. So I mean, and by this I mean something like SWIFT codes, but better and tailored to the specificities of the industry. This is nothing that the FATF or regulators should set up. I think this is something that we can drive as an industry. So yeah, that's just.
I love that. I think it's so critical. I think the unique qualities of blockchains, right? The open nature, the transparency, the traceability, really allow us to do a lot more as an industry without necessarily government. Sort of the show don't tell type of piece here. I think something you both have gotten to, Isabella and Catarina, in the last couple of minutes, is something I think is really important, and I think FATF does a decent job of that, and that is tying the risks to the compliance expectations, right? I mean, when you talk about what are the various risks to the DeFi ecosystem, what are the various risks from DPRK, from North Korea, from cyber criminals, right? It's so important, I think, to tie that. There's a compliance expectation around travel rule, but how do we tie that to what the risks are, right? Because there's no one in the crypto space that wants to see North Korea continue to attack this ecosystem. And I think sort of tying compliance to that is really critical. And I think FATF does a good job here. I think it's something that we can certainly build off of. I mean, anecdotally, Isabella and I were in Japan for FATF's recent meeting, and there was a missile attack or a missile launch over Japan. The compliance needs and the risks are very, very real. To that end, Lana, like as we talk about building out, I feel like this is your total sweet spot as a chief compliance officer, a compliance guru, now travel rule expert. Talk me through sort of building out that compliance program, right? Integrating a travel rule vendor, integrating Notabene, having TRM. These are pieces to a broader puzzle. But would you talk a little bit about sort of how you think about building out that sort of overall travel rule compliance?
The most simplest way of doing it is obviously just set up a demo with us. No, just joking. But in all seriousness, I think
we're okay with shameless plugs on TRM. At least one a show, I think is totally. Right. Yeah.
I got mine in.
Yeah.
So, but FATF provided guidance on how to assess the sustainability of a travel rule solutions provider in this targeted update, with a list actually of guiding questions that VASPs should ask to determine whether the potential travel rule compliance tool will comply with FATF requirements, right? That's really simple, right? So I would suggest that to be a great starting point. And it has like questions on there, consideration questions. For example, ensuring that the solution that you would choose would cover all asset types, and it would cover low thresholds, not just high thresholds. It supports pre-transaction, that security and safety are engraved into the solution, that it can help identify and perform VASP due diligence, and the list goes on and on. So for those that don't know where to start there. FATF gives you a list. Ask those questions. It's a great starting set, I would say. And then also kind of taking a step back, I always like to bring it back that, travel rule is not just about sending the originator and the beneficiary information, right? A lot of the compliance officers come from the traditional financial institutions and kind of the first level principles engraved in us. And this is kind of where we're coming from when you think about the point of travel rule compliance, right? It is to identify a suspicious activity pre-transaction before it occurs on the blockchain. And if you do identify it, to take freezing actions and to report it, right? So think about it in the broader sense. It should be thought about in your compliance stack and part of your compliance stack. It should not be a check the box, thing that you're just doing because this regulation came up and it's really annoying. Think about it from a positive perspective, that for the first time ever, I would almost argue, we in the crypto industry have an ability to do something pre-transaction to stop it before it occurs on the blockchain. And overall, it reduces your risk exposure.
Really well said.
Yeah. But just sort of adding to that, because I think there are so many opportunities. We do also have some challenges. One question before we sort of talk about the big thorny issue of interoperability. There are a lot of issues also around sort of what happens when you do freeze transactions, and then sort of what happens next, and how that also differs in different jurisdictions. And I think a lot of people, in Catarina, you've also mentioned the issue of sort of the rules applying to domestic VASPs, but then also how those look across borders. Do you think that's one of the main issues in the differences in rules and controls in travel rule, or is there sort of other points that keep you guys up at night?
I guess I would say that's definitely a challenge, but thankfully one that we solved. So essentially, yes, requirements do differ across jurisdictions, both in terms of the threshold that applies, the scope of information you need to provide. Also, requirements differ regarding counterparty VAS due diligence, approach to self-hosted wallet transactions, a bunch of things. Essentially, how we handle it in our platform is we embed the jurisdictional requirements of each jurisdiction in the system. So when you're initiating a transaction, you can validate that you're including all the information that you need to include according to your jurisdiction. And you can also receive warnings in case your counterparty's jurisdiction would require more than what you're providing. to help you make decisions around what information to transmit in each case. So I think that's definitely a challenge, but one that vendors can solve. So I wouldn't say that keeps us up at night building the rules into the system, but not in terms of being worried about overcoming the challenge. I think that's one. One thing I would say, though, is for VASPs, it's difficult to understand how to deal with those scenarios, how to build policies and procedures around these cases. So, for instance, if I'm a UK VASP transacting with a US VASP, for instance, if I receive a deposit that is below the threshold in the US, which is $3,000, then I'm probably not going to receive any information for that transaction. And according to UK rules, I would be required to. So how do I deal with that case? So I think from the legislator's point of view and the regulator's point of view, it's important to give guidance and set clear expectations on how VASPs are supposed to deal with cross-border variations.
Yeah, I think without a doubt, like that is the most common question I get about travel rule compliance. But I think the most common challenge that FATF really pulls out in this report is the issue around interoperability between vendors. And I know you guys have done lots of really innovative thinking about how we could overcome this problem of interoperability. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can say, I can't give away our secret sauce, so as the saying goes, but I can tell you that we are one of the most open and secure platforms for your full travel rule compliance. We make it extremely easy and seamlessly to integrate and incorporate, for example, blockchain analytics information, such as that of TRM as our partners into the platform, along with sanction screening of both the wallet and the name screening. Notabene is a pre-transaction decision-making platform, and we offer a secure, holistic view of crypto transactions. We enable customers to automate real-time decision-making and perform that counterparty sanction screening that we were talking about, identify the self-hosted wallets, and really have a complete smooth rollout of travel rule compliance in line with all of these global regulations. Our product essentially is one of the first protocol agnostic solutions, and therefore it allows VASPs to connect to an open global network and to securely exchange data transfers across these jurisdictions. To address cases where the counterparty is part of a closed network, that a VASP does not participate in, for example. So we built a travel rule protocol gateway, and that standardizes the connection to different protocols. We are protocol agnostic, as I mentioned, and we have various integrations with various protocols, such as that of TRP, Code, Shift, and there's many more that are going live this quarter. So interoperability is not such a big concern for us, and we're happy to say that, I think the exact numbers is 86% of our customers are able to reach their counterparty. So we really like to focus on the reachability aspect.
So there are solutions here. There's interoperability. There's the tech solutions here. You have the blockchain intelligence piece built in. Maybe this one's for Catarina, sort of wrapping us up a little bit here. Busting out your crystal ball then. FATF has now said implementation. Where do you see the space in 6 to 12 months? And Lana, feel free to jump in here as well. Are we going to see jurisdictions sort of fall in line, heed FATF's warning, or quite frankly, is it just too hard?
It's a good question. It's a bit hard for me to guess how effective the call outs from the FATF will be. But I think what we can say is that on one hand, in 6 months from now, we'll definitely have VASPs in key jurisdictions like the UK, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, and so on, that are already complying with the travel rule and that have, by that time, substantial operational experience with travel rule processes. So that's a given because there are several key jurisdictions that already passed travel rule legislation and where VASPs are going live with the travel rule and becoming experience with these processes. And one thing that I can anticipate is that these VASPs that are already or will be complying in 6 months will be increasingly inclined to stop transacting with VASPs that are not complying. So to give you a bit of background on this, back in October last year, we asked, as part of our yearly State of Travel Rule report, how do you proceed if you're not able to send a travel rule transfer to your counterparty VASP? So what do you do if your counterparty VASP is, for instance, not live with the travel rule, not complying yet, or maybe using a solution that is not interoperable? In October last year, only around 80% of respondents said that they would not transact unless they were able to comply with the travel rule. But we expect this percentage to increase, and we'll see it once we run our survey again this year. But we definitely expect this percentage to increase as travel rule comes into force in more jurisdictions and enforcement gets stricter. So I think that's one trend that we can expect for the next 6 months, because regardless of the FATF call-out, there are more jurisdictions rolling out travel rule. But then on the other hand, if we think about the next 12 months, for instance, we realize that the transfer of funds regulation will not be in force yet in 12 months. It will actually only come into force on the 30th of December of 2024.
And if we look for clarification, you're talking about sort of Europe's travel rule that really coming out of the marketing crypto assets legislation, as well as that sort of AML, parallel AML legislation. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. So essentially, the transfer of funds regulation is the instrument that will make sure that travel rule is in force for all crypto companies in the European Union. And that instrument only in 12 months will not be in force yet. In Europe, there are some countries that went ahead and passed travel rule legislation even ahead of the transfer of funds regulation. But that shows you that even in 12 months from now, we will still be on the sunrise period, and we'll still facing the same sunrise period challenges that we were talking about today. So to sum up, I would say, I think it's fair to say I'm optimistic that in the next 6 months, we'll make a lot of progress on travel rule adoption and operationalization. For sure, there are key jurisdictions moving ahead, and the urgency is there. But I'm also aware that even 1 year from now, key challenges like the sunrise period will continue to be a reality. So,
really sharp answer to a tough question. And I think that the Europe point is really key, right? You have comprehensive rules coming, but it may sort of be beyond our crystal ball capabilities here. Lana, Isabella, feel free to jump in on this as we kind of wrap things up.
I like to be a hopeless optimistic.
I love that about you.
When it comes to this, I think Catarina hit it spot on. Not too much to add there, except to say that it'll be interesting to see how, if we want to call this a name shaming list, almost, I think where what I've saw kind of floating around on Twitter, we'll see. It'll be interesting to see the effect that this will have on some of the jurisdictions, because obviously nobody wants to be on any list from FATF unless it's some sort of a good list, right? Simple as that. So it'll be interesting to see if that's going to really put like some fire under some jurisdictions to kind of close the gap on.
Yeah, no, it's a great call out. I mean, FATF's sort of stick has always been the ability to put you on a gray list in terms of a jurisdiction with money laundering, gaps, concerns. Isabella, take us home here. Where do you see all of this sort of implementation going, or what may we see from FATF? Sort of, you previewed it a little bit.
No, absolutely. I mean, yes, I think Lana hit the nail on the head. Like, what will happen with this list will be really interesting. It's important to highlight at this point. We don't know if it's a good or a bad list. It's a list that provides further information in real time, which is great, because normally we'd have to wait for the sort of a mutual evaluation or a consolidated list, a rankings list. So I think what will be really interesting is once we have that list, is how are people going to use it? Lana said, how will it change the perception of different countries, but equally, how will the private sector use this list? What information does it give it? And to Catarina's point, yes, the EU is still a bit of a way off, but once we have the EU in full implementation with a really strong supervisor coming in from AMLA, do we then reach this critical mass point where all the leading crypto hubs around the world are implementing this to some extent and supervising it and enforcing it. And then we get to a point where at least the vast majority of global crypto volume is going through some sort of travel rule jurisdiction. And then I think we'll have the tipping point. So maybe not quite 12 months, but I'll join the group of optimists. We're going to get there in the end.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Catarina. Look, I think these discussions are best when there are solutions, right? And what Notabene and TRM are doing together to improve travel rule compliance and mitigate the risk of illicit activity is so critical, and there is a solution there. To learn much more, check out Notabene's website, notabene.id, where there's a great new report talking about this exact issue in terms of compliance with FATF standards. Check out our website, trmlabs.com. Subscribe, as always, to the weekly roundup, and stay tuned for our next TRM Talks. In the meantime, thank you for helping us build a safer financial system. Have a great day, everybody.